Hello folks, welcome to our canal channel Jose. Today we're going to give you an idea how we do the rear shock replacement on a 2007 to 2011 Toyota Camry or in a 2008 2012 Toyota Avalon. And we're replacing on this our case just the cylinder. So we're going to transfer the spring and the base to our new shock, so that way we can make a strut. So if you're just replacing the whole thing as a strut, then you don't have to compress it. It's even going to be easier to do that replacement. So we're going to give you an idea how we do all that about replacing the shock and transferring all that. Once we replace these components, it's recommended to do an alignment because the symmetry has changed. So that way the wheels don't wear out uneven. So with that said, let's show you how we do this replacement. One thing that we have done that we want to mention is that once we're replacing the struts or you're removing the link kits on the car, you want to put both sides in the air, because that tire can send pressure to the other side with the sway bar. So you don't want that. So if you lift the car and you set it rested on jack stands, you're not going to have that pressure from one tire to another. That's going to make your job way easier. Now we have taken off the wheel, the rear passenger wheel, so we can remove and replace the strut. And for us, we have to go as well inside the cab, and we have to remove this piece to get access to the hardware that is holding the upper piece of the strut into the frame of the car. So this is the way we're going to access it, through here. And to remove this, we have to remove a 12mm bolt that is right down there. We can barely see it. And then take this piece off. If you don't want to get this dirty while you're working in there, what you can do is you can pop it off from the front. There's one tab in the bottom and one tab in here, and then you just pull it straight up, and then you just both sides, you pull one, and then you go into the other side and pull it, and it pops off, and then you slide it off because there's some two hooks that go in the back. So once you slide it up, you can remove it, so that way you don't get it dirty at the ends where we're going to be actually putting the tools through. So now that we have removed the bottom piece, we have to remove that 12mm bolt that is down there. So we can remove this guy out of here, because if you try to pull it, you're going to break it off. You got to screw that bolt, and then we can take this off. So now that we have unbolted our bolt from the bottom, we can come up here and take the seatbelt off of the guide, because that's not coming with a piece of foam. We unbolted, now we got to push it up and then pull it away. So now this is the point where it bolts on in the bottom, and then the hook that we're talking about is right here. If you pull straight out, you're gonna probably break it off. You don't want to do that. So now we remove the bottom piece, the side piece for the seat, and we expose now what we need to work on for the strut right there. The piece, the three nuts that hold the structure of this strut towards the frame of the car. Now that we have exposed that, we can come down here and start taking this apart. So now down below here, we have to remove this bolt here to remove the brake hose and the sensor, and then we have to remove that nut for the link kit that connects from the stabilizing bar to the strut, just from this part. We don't have to go and undo it from the bottom. And then we have to remove the two main bolts that go to the spindle. There's bolts with nuts, so we take those as well, and then we take completely off from above so we can drop it. We recommend that you use lubricant to those threads, so when you're taking the bolts or the nuts off, then everything comes off easier, because they've been exposed to water and debris and all that sorts of stuff. And to take out this bolt that holds the brake hose against the strut, we need a 12mm socket. So now that we have removed that 12mm that holds the brake hose against it, there's a 10mm bolt as well right next to it that holds a sensor to the strut. We got to take that off, 10mm. Now we remove the link kit nut that is at 14mm. So now we're going to be removing the main two bolts that hold this bottom structure against the spindle. And for those, we need a 19mm socket and wrench. We're going to be using an impact gun for this because they're going to be pretty tight. Now up here is 3 nuts, and they're a 12mm socket or wrench needed to take these off. Now we can take that nut completely off, so we can now grab the strut and drop it. So now here we have our full structure. This is the strut and this is the shock right now because it doesn't have the spring and the upper base. So if you're just replacing the whole structure with spring and base and all that, you don't have to transfer none of that to the new one because it comes complete. You just slide it back in and start bolting it in place. But in our case, we're going to transfer all this to this one and we're going to show you those procedures. This is the dangerous part because this springs are compressed and they keep energy here. So there's components that we have to, a nut that we have to remove to transfer all that to this, but it has to be done carefully and sometimes tools are needed for these procedures. So we're going to show you how we do that. But if you're, like we said, if yours comes complete on the new one, you just slide it right in there and bolt it down. But we're going to transfer now everything to this one. So right now this is our suspension. It's just bouncing up and down because there's no structure of the strut in here. What we're going to be using is this tool. This is a spring compressor, and we acquired this because we replace our own struts or shocks, and then we transfer everything to the other new shock. So this is a actual shop tool, but in your case you're probably going to have to take it to a place where they can compress that or do it yourself with the special tools, but more basic than this that you can do the job. But on this case, we're using this tool, and this is the critical part. You want to be careful when you're doing this job. So now, as we can see, there's no pressure. The strut, the spring is being compressed. So this point, now the energy is being controlled by the machine in compressing the spring, so we can take up the top nut. And then one thing we want to say is that you want to mark, you want to keep in mind that you want to line up the spring and everything back into the strut as it was, so everything lines up when you put it back on, because the upper base and the lower bolts what have to go in as everything came out on the same pattern or the same lineup. So you want to keep that in mind, line up the springs and everything as it was. Transfer the lower base gasket or rubber and the upper one into the new strut, so we can start sliding it into the upper base. Now that we have fed the new components to the new shock, we can feed it in and start bolting it down. One thing before you start feeding the shock into the upper piece, you want to make sure that you line up this with the upper piece, because it has, the shock is being cut out a little bit, so it has a low point and it's a guide. So you want to make sure you start feeding it in, it falls in on the groove as it should, because otherwise if you try to force it and force it, you're going to damage the threads on the top, and once it falls in, then you're going to have trouble with that nut. So you want to make sure you don't damage this while putting it in. So one thing that we're going to be doing is that we have already threaded a nut as much as we could by hand into the strut. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to expand the spring and let it rest in the strut and on the both bases. So that way, when we tighten it, none of the stuff spin around, because right now if we tighten it, the strut is going to turn and there's going to be no pressure applied to it. So it's just going to spin. So we're going to expand it, and then once everything's back to normal, then we tighten that completely down. Now you can see how much of the nut is in there by hand and a little bit with a tool. And now that we have it outside, we're gonna completely tighten it with the impact gun so that way it sets itself. So now as you can see, the nut fell in and tightened itself, and now the strut is showing a little bit more threads than before. So now we have the structure put together. We're gonna feed our strut in, and we're gonna guide it out in the upper part, and then we're gonna just put the nuts from inside and just present them so it moves around, and then we come down here and present it down here. Because you're trying to line up the top when you have already have put in the bottom, you're gonna have a hard time. So feed the upper part first, present it, put the nuts in there, just loose, and then come down here, and then we line up the bottom piece. So now we have the strut in there, just present it on the upper part. It's loose. So the three nuts, they're just there, they're not tight, so we can still work with it in the lower part. So you're gonna be asking yourself, hey, but my strut is a little crooked, it's not going into the lower part. So what you can do is you can grab it, both hands, and turn it so you can line it up, and you can do that. So now you can start sliding it into the spindle and bolting it down. That's why we said in the beginning, make sure that when you take it out, you probably try to line up everything on the structures when you're putting it in, so that way the adjustment here is minimum by hand. Now we can guide the strut to the base, and we put the bolt in. So now that they're in, and they're getting harder to pull in, but they're in, we put the nuts, and then we start tightening it. It's gonna pull it in when we're tightening it. Now that we have bolted down our two main bolts, we can secure the brake hose and the sensor so they're not floating around. Now we put our link kit back in there, and we put the 14mm nut, and then we tighten it. So now that we have the link kit connected, tighten it down, the 12mm and the 10mm bolts into it for the brake hose and the sensor. Those two, the main ones, we still have to tighten them. But before we do that, we go up into the base inside, and we tighten those. So now that we finish putting the strut in, what we do is we'll come back into the cab, and then we take the foam or the part of the seat that goes on the side, we put it on, and then we bolted it down on the bottom, because there's no need for us to come back in here. We're done here. Next thing, we're gonna go to the driver's side and take the other one out. But for now, we take that one in and put it back where it needs to go. There's the hook on the upper piece that goes right in here. Once you slide it and hook it and feel that it's hooked on there, then you gotta guide this hole and bolt the 12mm bolt in there so it holds the structure from coming out. So now we hook it and tighten it down. So there it is. We have guided, hook it, bolt, tighten it down. Now we just get the seat belt, pass it through the groove, slide it in there, and then we go to the other side. So now we take the seat belt out of this groove, the guide, and then we unbolted the 12mm bolt for this foam. We slide it up and we pull it out so we can start exposing the nuts that hold the structure of the strut against the frame on the driver's side. So once we remove it, we have exposed the 3 nuts that hold the structure of the strut against the frame on the upper piece. So we have to take those 3 off to take the strut out. Now we can remove our link kit, the nut, that 14 millimeter. So now we remove the 12 millimeter bolt that holds the brake hose against the structure, and the 10 millimeter that holds the sensor, the wheel sensor, against the structure of the strut as well. So now that we have removed all the bolts and the link kit, and we have loosened the main bolts, for the nuts we took them off and they're just there, what we do is we come up here and we loosen the 12 millimeter nuts completely, a little bit of threads in there so we can control how it falls off when we slide that off. So we can't just let it drop. We take those out and then we work up there once we have everything loose. So what we did is we took the inner nuts off, the 2, and then we left 1 up there holding the structure. So when we take the bottom 1 bolts out, we can control how it comes out so it doesn't just fall on us. So what we do, we take out the bolts now. Bottom base, rubber piece where the spring falls. We grab the boot and we put it on and we start putting it together. So now that we have our strut complete, we tighten it, that bolt, that nut. Now we can start feeding it, guide it on the upper piece, and then we can just put the 3 nuts in there to hold it so we can line it up in the bottom. We feed the strut in to the upper base, and we have to line up the bottom. We just put the 3 nuts in there to hold it from falling off while we work in the bottom. So now we line up the bottom and then we put the 2 main bolts. Now that we fed those 2 main bolts in, we can bolt down the brake hose and the sensor. Now we can even put in our link kit and tighten it down. So now that we have bolted down our brake hose and our sensor, the link kit, now we put the main 2 nuts for the bolt and we tighten it down. Now that we have tightened everything in the bottom, we come up here and we tighten the 3 12 millimeter nuts completely down. Now that we have tightened it up here as well, everything's down below tight as well. Now we can put the other piece of the seat right in here. And this side has a hook, just like the passenger side, and the bolt down point as well. So now that we have everything back together, we got to put our lower seat, and it slides underneath there. Make sure the seat belt show, and then it pops right in here and that other end right there. And that's your fuel pump access. And we're done with the replacement of the rear shocks or struts for Toyota Camry. Well, folks, hopefully this video was useful and helpful. How to replace the rear shocks or struts on a 2007 to 2011 Toyota Camry, or in a 2008 to 2012 Toyota Avalon. So the most important thing about this is that if you're replacing just a shock and you're transferring the spring from one to another, you gotta compress the spring before you start unbolting it from the top. Otherwise, that is gonna shoot out like a projectile because the tension or the energy that is being compressed in there from the spring. So that's one important thing. You gotta control the energy before you start taking that stuff apart. And another thing is that you want to lift your car from the back, both tires off the ground, because the sway bar is going to be sending pressure from one side to another while one tire is on the ground. So you'll be having problems taking one shock out when the other one is on the ground. So for our friends who are watching our video, haven't subscribed to our channel, please subscribe. If you like a video, give us thumbs up, share it, and we'll see you soon with more videos here in El Canal, El Chano Jose.